Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy Monday. Thank you for tuning in. There is so much news to get to, as there often is Monday morning. So much happening over the weekends now. We never get a break, Linda.
I'd hardly sleep, Robbie, but I'm glad to see you this Monday morning.
Glad to see you as well.
What's on your radar?
Happy to tell you. Well, President Donald Trump is determined to bring foreign governments to heel and is moving forward with tariffs on our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, in order to encourage them to take border security more seriously. Now, even if you believe, as many fervent supporters of MAGA do, that it's a necessary move to shore up U.S. national security and convince the rest of the world that Trump means business, no more treating us like chumps, the truth is that the tariffs are going to increase prices for U.S. consumers. That's just how it works. Now, maybe the short-term pain will be worth the long-term investment in restoring America's standing and making sure our borders are respected. But there will be short-term pain. Now, in theory, this could create an opening for the Democratic Party. American voters, after all, do not like higher prices. Inflation was a top concern of voters in this election. And if Trump is perceived as having failed to bring prices under control, then the Democrats could, in theory, capitalize on that. Unfortunately for the Democrats, but very, very fortunately for the GOP, there's little evidence that Team Blue has learned from any of its mistakes. Look no further than this past weekend's Democratic National Committee leadership elections, where a new chair was elected to replace outgoing chair Jamie Harrison. That new chair is Ken Martin, a Minnesota politician and previous vice chair. Now, the best thing about Ken Martin is that he was opposed by some members of the Democratic establishment. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries all endorsed his leading opponent, Ben Wilker. That should be a badge of honor. The leaders of the party have driven off a cliff given Dems' recent electoral performance. But even so, Martin does not seem to think the Dems have a messaging problem. On the contrary, he confidently assured Democrats gathered for the leadership election that the party already, quote, has the right message. Worse still, Martin and virtually every other nominee position doubled or even tripled down on identity politics as the way forward for Democrats. The Atlantic magazine's Jonathan Chait described a meeting that was marred by, quote, a land acknowledgement, multiple shrieking interruptions by angry protesters, and a general affirmation that its strategy had been sound except perhaps insufficiently committed to legalistic race and gender essentialism, end quote. In fact, outgoing chair Jamie Harrison spent significant time explaining that the rules for the vice chair race specify that, quote, when we have a gender non-binary candidate for office, the non-binary individual is counted as neither male nor female, and the remaining 6 officers must be gender balanced. That sounds like a kind of parody of wokeness that one might hear on a South Park sketch. But no, it really happened. And the leadership candidates supported this strategy of race and gender obsession. Now, they were given practically no choice. The leadership debate was moderated by a bunch of MSNBC pundits, the very wokest of the woke, and they continually pressed the candidates to prioritize skin color, token diversity, and every kind of cultural signifier that thrills mainstream elites as much as it annoys everyone else, in particular the working class. Independent left-leaning journalist Li Fang described the event as, quote, a dark money election of party loyalists, more consumed with identity politics than interested in why working-class voters have drifted away. If anything, that's an understatement. Jonathan Capehart, for instance, one of the moderators, pressed the gathered candidates to concede that Kamala Harris's defeat at the hands of Donald Trump was due to racism and sexism. Let's watch.
I have a show of hands. How many of you believe that racism and misogyny played a role in Vice President Harris's defeat? Okay. So that's good. You all passed.
Did you catch what he said there at the end? That was the moderator asserting that the only correct answer to that question was yes. Blame racism, blame sexism, blame anything but Kamala's own campaign. Now, one of the candidates up there that was trying to have a more nuanced opinion on all of this was Faye Shakur, former campaign director for Bernie Sanders. He is a minority himself, but thinks the way Democrats talk about race and diversity issues is alienating to normal people.
But if we focus on these kinds of economic justice issues, I believe we have an opportunity to bring people in who may not agree with us on racial, cultural, and other social justice matters. But when they see that Democratic Party put economic justice as a primacy issue, I do believe that it is our long-held proud lineage. That's what they want to support.
That was a good answer. I don't agree with Shakir's views on all economic issues, but I would readily concede that the platform he advocates, focusing first and foremost on the government delivering on benefits for working people, that is a winning platform. You know what's not a winning platform? Blaming the voters and calling them racist. Unfortunately, that's exactly what MSNBC wants the Democrats to do. Let's actually watch the question from Capehart that had produced the response we just watched.
Given that President Trump ran and he openly and consistently employed racist and misogynistic rhetoric on the campaign trail, we cannot ignore the role of fear and hate in Vice President Harris's defeat. How would you, as DNC chair, handle voter prejudices while also addressing their real concerns about substantive policy issues?
Voters' prejudices. To be clear, Shakir's answer is not the problem. The problem is the question he was asked, which presumed that voters are too racist and uninformed, and that's why someone like Kamala couldn't win. No, Kamala couldn't win because her advisors spend too much time listening to people like Jonathan Capehart. With friends like these, Democrats could be permanently doomed to toil in obscurity. Honestly, it's unsporting for the GOP to be so thoroughly unrivaled. The American political system functions better when both parties are competing for the support of everyday working Americans. If one party is doing that, while the other is doing land acknowledgments, this doesn't end well. To talk more about this issue, we have, I'm pleased to say, independent journalist Lee Fong is with us here at Rising. Lee, thank you so much for joining Linda and I.
Hey, good to see you, Robbie.
So you covered this leadership election debate series a bit more thoroughly than I did. So please tell me if my impressions of it were off. But every clip I saw make its way onto social media, I was like, oh my God. And I think conservatives were saying, oh my God, they were so happy to see so much of the conversation derailed by whatever you want to call it. I would call it identity politics, but whatever it is, to me, it seems anathema to what many Democratic voters are looking for.
No, your comments were completely on the mark here. This did not sound like a party that was really motivated to win future elections. It sounded like an institution that was in denial of the very recent past of the 2024 election. They were not willing to discuss the problems with President Biden and his cognitive decline, the kind of denial around that, the very shaky departure, why it took so long for him to step down, the process for nominating Kamala Harris, any of the issues around Kamala Harris's campaign. There's really a litany of issues where the Democratic Party has fractured and has, failed to appeal to voters. None of these issues were discussed. There's a dynamic kind of generally known as the iron law of institutions, that many times elites within an institution are more motivated to focus on the control of the institution rather than adapting for the success of an institution. So here we have party leaders, rather than adapting for the future success of the Democratic Party, they're doubling down to make sure that they control the institution at hand. So these are Democratic bureaucrats, no discussion of the many corporate lobbyists that make up the DNC voting members. This party election, this was not for the voters, really for grassroots people who consider themselves Democrats. These are party chairs. These are lobbyists for insurance companies, for drug companies. Even the outgoing chair, Jamie Harrison, he's a former defense contractor and pharma lobbyist. And, rather than discuss any of these ethics issues or these issues with big money or dark money, it sounds more like a faculty meeting at an elite college where they're talking about superficial identity politics, the politics of gender. You had these vice chair candidates, rather than discussing their experience or their new ideas to change the party, they're obsessively, you watch the party forum, they're obsessively talking about their own biography in identity terms, talking about their skin color or their sexual preferences as qualifications to run the party. So this is a party that's inherently, essentially out of touch with normal people. The polls show, recent experience shows that the voters are tired of this kind of, for whatever you want to call it, woke, a form of politics, this kind of very elite form of class politics that are obsessed with race and sexual gender. But again, they've doubled down really on the status quo, and they're seemingly incapable for change.
Lee, what else did they talk about as part of this electoral process the other day?
Well, look, if you watch the clips here, there were some discussion of reform of the party. You know, there's anger among many officials there of, you know, a lack of transparency in the budget, kind of a focus on big money consultants. No names were named because I think a lot of those consultants were in the audience. Folks like Dewey Square Group and others, there's kind of establishment consultants that have really drained the party of money, not really established many significant results, that still control the party. Dewey Square's partner, Minion Moore, was the chair of the DNC convention last year. So, you know, these party consultants are really play a powerful role. But rather than really discussing the conflicts of interest there, because these are folks who also, again, represent Silicon Valley, Uber, the big pharmaceutical companies, there was, again, this kind of obsession with racial quotas and affirmative action. Ken Martin, the candidate who eventually triumphed and is now the chair of the DNC, he said, you know, we need to have Black-owned or minority-owned consultants. That's the issue. You know, it's like, again, this kind of beginning to discuss a reform issue, but then veering off into the superficial politics of identity. And of course, there are many platitudes about needing to organize more, needing to, you know, knock on every door, or, you know, work in all 50 states. Sure, that sounds good, but, you know, that's the kind of rhetoric you hear every 4 years at these types of elections or forums. There really weren't that many discussions of big ideas or how to appeal to the big voting blocs that have left the party. You know, working class has left the party. You know, voters are making less than $50,000. You know, historically, a column that was always in the Democrats' favor, voted for Donald Trump. You had a big departure of Black and Latino men to Donald Trump. You have the youth vote, especially young men, going to Trump. And, you know, there was no discussion really of this crisis, of how to fix this monumental problem for the Democratic Party.
And the role of MSNBC in this debate was, I think, particularly pernicious, or will have a particularly pernicious impact on the party. You know, if these people see their goal, you know, if they want to branch away from the kind of identity politics we're describing, they were going to be beaten up by the moderators of this forum, of this format. You know, if they see part of their job, or their main job is to be on MSNBC and speak to the audience that is there, which is very partisan motivated Dems, I would say it's a shrinking audience, and it's not enough to still win an election, but you do have to speak to those people to some degree. Of course, they're part of the base. They're going to be incentivized to do that in language that is increasingly alienating to everyone else, per the instructions coming from Simone Sanders and Jonathan Capehart and the other people. They were like encouraging the candidates to portray themselves in maximally alienating ways, seemingly without any self-reflection, with less reflection than the candidates themselves have.
No, that is an excellent point. And look, there's a lot of great media outlets out there, but every media outlet reflects its own biases, right? Like, we don't see the RNC going to the Wall Street Journal editorial board to moderate their, you know, equivalent forums. You know, the Wall Street Journal is a great institution, but their editorial board represents a certain faction of the party, represents a more pro-big business, pro-establishment, pro-neocon ideology. And so, you know, if you go to a certain media outlet that has that ideology, they will corral you in line with that view. So if you go to to MSNBC, that is very obsessed with superficial identity politics, very establishment friendly, then, you know, no surprise here. That's the kind of corral that's the moderators are pushing the candidates towards their own issues, their own pet issues, towards, again, superficial identity politics. I mean, really, not to flatter you guys, but for the DNC, for Democrats to adapt to the future, shows like this, like Rising, shows that are anti-establishment, that are populist, that are heterodox, that discuss big ideas and kind of represent kind of outside the box thinking, that needs to be the kind of focus for Democrats. Look at what Donald Trump did last year. He avoided the kind of establishment media that represents kind of the conventional wisdom or the status quo. He went on Theo Vaughn. He went on Joe Rogan. He went on these more populist podcasts because that is what is more in sync with viewers. I mean, this idea that MSNBC, that, you know, in prime time, they have something like 300,000 listeners or less, and they would just eschew populist YouTube shows or online media that has tens of millions of audience members. I mean, that just seems crazy, but it shows you where the Democrats are. They're really not in line with what voters are doing. They're kind of desperately seeking media outlets and other institutions that reaffirm their establishment bias.
Well, Lee, we will take that compliment about rising, but I do want to circle back to the point you're making about who was in the room and who was listening. It seems fair to point out that it was an audience of party stalwarts, and that most people, most ordinary everyday Americans, are not tuning in to the DNC chairmanship election. I wonder if you had the chance to talk to any of the candidates either heading into the election or coming out of it about other conversations they might be having to a broader public about the issues.
Look, I've talked to a few DNC members. There is kind of a concern around this kind of reorientation towards the establishment. The former kind of Biden-appointed chair, Jamie Harrison, and others, they changed the party calendar. There was not much of a discussion around this, but there's a lot of alarm in the kind of back rooms of the Democratic Party about this orientation towards the establishment. You know, historically, the Democratic Party chose their candidates through a calendar that had Iowa caucus going first, and then New Hampshire, and then South Carolina. For whatever reason, you know, it's worth a longer discussion. I don't think we have time for it here. But rural voters, college voters, other voters in Iowa and New Hampshire seem to kind of drift towards more anti-establishment populist candidates. That's, you know, 1968, that's where you kind of saw voters rebel against President Lyndon Johnson over the Vietnam War. When Bill Clinton was seen as an outsider in the early 90s, you know, Bill Clinton did well in Iowa. Barack Obama, of course, triumphing in these early caucus states when he was seen as an outsider, Bernie Sanders and others. Well, guess what? As an overt attempt to kind of keep outsiders, keep populists out of the party, the Biden-appointed leadership of the Democratic Party changed the schedule. So, you know, going up against, you know, in 2028, when Democrats need to find a new viable leader, they changed the schedule to preferencing South Carolina first. And this is historically, this is a much older electorate, the most culturally conservative candidates in the country. And this is a state that, at least historically, preferences more establishment candidates. So it makes it more unlikely that another populist or anti-establishment or outsider candidate gets the nomination. It's really just this kind of layer after layer of institutional bias to prevent reform and change. And that's something that I've heard from several party officials, from several activists who are, you know, involved in the DNC, although I did not hear it in that forum in Georgetown. I haven't heard it much in these more public debates, but it's clearly an issue going forward.
Fascinating. Lee, thank you so much for your take on this issue.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to see you both.